Hi, I'm Andrew Torget with Texas History for Teachers. When the stock market crashed on Wall Street in October of 1929, it marked the beginning of a crisis known as the Great Depression, which was the worst economic disaster that Americans have ever faced. The entire economy collapsed. Banks failed, businesses went bankrupt, which meant that people began losing their jobs, their savings, and sometimes their homes. This happened across the entire United States, but the Depression hit Texas with particularly devastating force, as the 1930s became one of the most trying decades in all of American history. But then something remarkable happened. People refused to give up, and the federal government began something called the New Deal, which was a series of programs that hired people to do things like build roads and bridges and sidewalks and libraries and so much else. The idea was to put Texans, and really all Americans, back to work as a way to fix the economy. And it had a tremendous effect on the state. Between the devastation of the Depression and the many programs of the New Deal, Texas would be transformed during the long, dark years of the 1930s. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, how exactly did the Great Depression change Texas? And how did Texans make it through the worst economic crisis in all of American history? Well, let's start with how bad things got. In 1929, just before the Depression hit, the Texas economy had actually been doing pretty well. At the time, most Texans were either cotton farmers or they were involved in the oil industry. And the good news was that in 1929, you could get pretty decently high prices for both cotton and oil. But then, in October of that year, the stock market just suddenly crashed. Americans lost $40 billion overnight. And then everything began falling apart. Almost immediately, businesses began failing and people lost their jobs. And so they stopped buying things. And that was a major problem because suddenly nobody wanted to buy the only two things that Texans had to sell, cotton and oil. And that ensured that the Texas economy, alongside the US economy, just completely collapsed. By 1933, unemployment in the United States was at an astounding 25%. And by 1934, more than 1 million Texans needed help just feeding and clothing their families. Now, in the depths of all of this, Texans helped elect President Franklin Roosevelt. Now, why Roosevelt? Well, he promised to try to solve the Great Depression by giving Americans what he called a New Deal, which turned out to be a series of programs and agencies that each tried to deal with the Depression. And these New Deal programs did a lot of things, but most of them focused on the US government hiring people to do important stuff, like building roads and bridges. The idea was really pretty simple. Put people back to work so that they can get a regular paycheck. People who get regular paychecks usually then start buying things that they need, like new clothes for their families, which would in turn bring customers back to businesses and create new jobs. Now, all of that, Roosevelt hoped, would help get the US economy back up on its feet once again. And so the federal government set up new programs like the Works Progress Administration, which hired 8.5 million Americans and eventually built 8,000 parks, 125,000 buildings, and more than 650,000 miles of roads during the Great Depression. Now, not everyone who was supposed to get these jobs got them. Some of the poorest people at the time did not get the help that they needed. Farmers, for example, were often left out. African Americans and Mexican Americans in particular were often purposefully excluded from these jobs. But there were a lot of remarkable things that came from the New Deal. And one of the best examples was a program that brought electricity to rural Texans. Before the 1930s, 98% of all Texas farmers did not have access to electricity. That meant they had no lights at night. They couldn't have a washing machine or a refrigerator. They couldn't even power a radio. Now, why were so many Texans still literally in the dark? Well, because it was expensive to put up new electrical lines. And the electric company said they couldn't afford to run those wires to distant farmhouses because they would never be able to make their money back. So to fix this, the federal government set up a New Deal program that lent money to farmers so that they could set up their own nonprofit electric companies to bring power to their homes. And it was a giant success. Imagine how much your life would suddenly change if, for the first time, you had access to electricity. Now, the New Deal did not solve everything. The economy had gotten better by the late 1930s, but the Depression had not ended, and many people still found themselves struggling. And some Texans had begun to worry that the federal government was just doing too much. The national government had never been this involved in the American economy before, and some people feared that Franklin Roosevelt might be overstepping his powers as president. Other people, however, worried that Roosevelt and the government had not done enough to end the Great Depression. And then suddenly the United States entered World War II, and everything changed once again. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, why was the Great Depression and the New Deal so transformative for Texas? And how would that, in turn, help Texas be ready for World War II?